Good evening. So very glad that you're here. Probably a couple of years ago, I was sitting in on a Bible class at a congregation we were visiting, and they were teaching the Psalms at that time, going through the different types of Psalms, and they were specifically talking about the Lament Psalms. These are a certain category of Psalms. There are praise Psalms and Thanksgiving Psalms, Messianic Psalms, and Lament Psalms are also actually the most common of all of them, where there is some problem that the psalmist is crying out to God about. And for the basis of the class, they were referencing a book written by a man named Glenn Pemberton. The title of the book is called Hurting with God, and it's a study of the Lament Psalms. And in this book and in the class, there was brought up the suggestion that there was a connection of a pattern in the way the Psalms are broken down. And the author made this suggestion that there is a connection between the parts of a psalm and the 5 stages of grief that people go through when there is some type of tragedy or catastrophe. Psychologists are familiar with this. You probably know most of those stages of grief. And it was very interesting to me. It really got me thinking and trying to look for these connections and see if they really were, if not parallel, at least very similar. And I found that the author was onto something, so I dove in a little deeper. If you're not familiar, the 5 stages of grief, and when something tragic happens in our life, there's a big change, a shock, an illness, a death, something that shakes us up. We go through 5 stages, basically. Psychologists acknowledge this. There's denial, first of all. There is anger, and then bargaining, and then depression, and finally acceptance. And there is a similar pattern that is found within a similar format in the Psalms that are classified as Lament Psalms. Theologists have singled these out as address, complaint, request, motivation to act, and praise. And there are some similarities. There's also a few important differences that we'll talk about. But what I want to do tonight is just see how well this comparison matches up, and if maybe we can use that as a springboard to deeper Bible study, a deeper appreciation, and ultimately really finding a way to apply this in our own lives when we find ourselves in those situations where we take a hit, when a wave comes and crashes over us. But one thing that we have to point out in this, there are some similarities, but what I want you to take note of is that there is a deep and important contrast between how a worldly-minded person that we see going through these psychological stages of grief would deal with adversity. There's a big difference between that approach and how a Christian deals with adversity. And there is an equally different outcome. And we'll see that as we go through this tonight. I want to just briefly go through those 5 stages of grief again. If you're not familiar with them, I just want to mention them very quickly so we have a basis of what we're going to be looking at tonight. The 5 stages of grief, again, begins with denial. So let's say that someone goes to the doctor and not feeling very well. All of a sudden, the nurse comes back and says, well, we've got the test results, and I'm afraid it's not very good news. You've got some very serious illness, and you may not have very long to live. Shocking news. Really suck the wind out of your sails. And a very common response to that would be denial. We'd say, well, there must be some mistake. No, that can't be. Are you sure about the test? You need to, let's run the test again, double check, and make sure that that's true. Or if the nurse or a physician's assistant has brought this news to you, you might be tempted to say, well, let me ask for the doctor. Let's get the doctor in here and see what he thinks about all this. And then the doctor comes in and says, well, yeah, that's what the test results look like. Then we say, well, let me talk to your superior then. Maybe you don't know exactly what you're talking about here. Let me talk to the specialist. We want to talk to a specialist and get that second opinion perhaps. But there is a sense of denial that we can't believe that God would let this happen to me. And it's a very common response. The next stage is often anger. The idea that what has happened is just not right. It shouldn't be this way. It's not right that this happened because, I exercised, I avoided the bad foods, and I ate the good foods, and I did what the doctor said. I exercised, and all those things that I was supposed to do. It's just not right that I should suffer this. Look at all those other people living terribly, not caring about their health, and I'm the one that gets sick. It just doesn't seem right, and anger, a very common response to that situation. The next stage would come bargaining. I might calm down for a minute and say, well, okay, I'm sorry, I got mad and upset. Let's try to work this out now. What's the solution? How do we fix this? What can I do now to change things? What price can I pay? What sacrifices can I make? And that bargaining stage, well, if I'll do this, then you'll do this. And we'll fix this thing. Many times there's not a fix. And that leads into the next stage of depression, where we realize, well, there's just nothing. There's no price that I can pay. There's no sacrifice I can make. There's nothing I can do about this. That this is just life. These things just happen. Why fight it? Why bother? We're all just doomed to die anyway, so what's the point in resisting or fighting? And that depression can be very damaging to many people. But ultimately, it does usually lead into a period of acceptance, where there is just a resignation, where we're at a point where there's nothing left but just to trust in God's will and in His goodness and in His plan. And really, when we get to that point, maybe we realize that's where we should have been all along in this whole process. But when we get to that point, what it does, it puts all the weight on God. It puts all the weight on God to act in the situation and to explain things and say why this is happening. But it requires us to trust Him and to be at peace. So those are the 5 stages of grief. Now let's look at the 5 stages, if you will, of the lament psalm. There is an address. This is how the Psalms begin. There is an address, speaking to God. Again, there's that idea. I want to speak to the one in charge. There's a problem here, and I need to go as high as I can. There's an address to God. There might even be involved in this a stunned disbelief that maybe God is not aware of this situation. And shocked that He has not already corrected this. This should have been taken care of already. And this is often, we see in the Psalms, lumped in with the next stage, which is the complaint. But there's a problem here, and often that address is combined very closely with the complaint. Something is wrong here. Something is in conflict with God's will. Something is in conflict with God's justice or with His nature. And something is not right. The righteous are suffering, for one example. Or the wicked seem to be prospering. Or there's some injustice that is going on. And God seems not to be acting. And this is where the complaint comes in. Lord, you need to do something about this. And then that request is the next stage. This is not a demand, but this is a request that is made of God. We have to handle this very carefully because it requires humility. It requires submission to God's authority and to His will. And we must ask, whatever it is that we're asking God to do, it must be according to His will. We can't be asking God to do something contrary to His nature. And it also must be fitting with His character and His actions in the past. He has to have shown a track record of doing these kinds of things and solving these kinds of problems. But there is a request that is made of God. There's an address, there's a complaint, the problem, and then there's a request, do something about it. Many times also there is a motivation to act, not really on our part, but on God's part. And what we see the psalmist many times writing about are the reasons why God ought to do something, why He must act. There is often a confidence that God will act, not simply just a request. Maybe God will, maybe He won't. The psalmist is often saying God is going to do something about this. He cannot not do something. You'll forgive my double negative there. But God's justice, God's very righteousness demands that He act. And the psalmist is often expressing confidence in that. I know God's going to do something because He is righteous. He is just. He won't allow this to stand. Now this is one of the areas we have a contrast to the 5 stages of psychological grief. Because at that stage here we would find the depression phase. Now this is not depression This is not a sense of apathy, but rather this is the exact opposite. This is a confidence that God is going to do something. There is an eagerness to see God move and do something. There's the attitude of, because God will act, I therefore will do this. There's a response on our part many times. This is not a bargain. This is the bargaining phase also. There's not a bargain here that is struck that, God, if you do this, then I'll do this. But rather, this is just a response to God's nature and to God's fidelity, to His faithfulness, that He's proven Himself to be faithful in the past. He's proven that He does not abide injustice, that He cannot abide sin, that the righteous will not be oppressed forever. This is similar to the idea that we have that we're not saved by works. We are not saved by works, we're saved by the grace of God. But works are a necessary part of our faith. And we see them often as a response. You see, we're not saved by works, but they are often a response on our part from a grateful and confident heart. Because God saved me, then I will do these things. Because He's commanded me to, and because I'm grateful to Him for my salvation. So there's sort of that similar type of relationship there. But the motivation to act is the fourth stage, and the final section, part of a lament psalm, is praise. Again, the psalmist, the writer, is expecting a positive response. And we see another contrast again with the stages of grief, is that there is not just a grim resignation, but rather there's optimism. There is a sense of positivity that God is going to do this. There's a confidence and expectation. And it gives us hope for the future, hope of God's response, and that there will be a solution to this. And you see, this is why this is important to us. This is not just an academic exercise here tonight. Because this is how struggles produce and strengthen our faith and our trust. When James says, rejoice in trials, because they produce faith. They strengthen faith. This is the process. This is how God makes this work. Because we go through these stages. There is a problem. We go to God with that problem. We know His nature will not allow Him to let this stand, so we're confident He's going to act. That produces gratitude on our part and a sense of optimism and hope for the future, that God's going to take care of this in His own time and His own way. So then, we are not as anxious or worried the next time this happens. Well, so how God got me through this one and this one and this one, and He's going to do the same thing with this problem I'm facing. He's going to do the same thing with the next problem I face. That's how God grows our faith through trials. It's not an enjoyable process many times, but it's predictable. Now, I'm taking a risk tonight. I'm risking covering too much. And I realize that, but I want you to see how this process works in real-life Bible study. I would rather work slowly and carefully through just one passage of Scripture. But forgive me tonight instead for broadly grazing across the top of two passages tonight, because I want you to see a bigger picture in this. So bear with me. It won't be too long, I promise. Turn to Psalm number 10, if you will. Psalm number 10, and we'll just plug this in, and we'll see how this pattern follows, and how we can read through the Scriptures, and you can see these for yourself. Psalm 10. Now this first stage, we would see, on the worldly mindset, we'd see a worldly denial, a sense of denial, this can't possibly be happening. But on behalf of the faithful, this is the address section. We see it in verse 1. Why do you stand afar off, O Lord? Why do you hide in times of trouble? This may not seem to be an address, but it is. It's asking a question of God, but it is addressing God as Lord. The idea of whatever this situation is, we haven't got to it yet. We haven't detailed it out. But this can't be. How can you, Lord of everything, allow this to happen? That's how this begins. The second stage is worldly anger, but faithful complaint. And that's in verses 2 through 11. And here we have the problem detailed. The wicked in his pride persecutes the poor. Let them be caught in the plot which they have devised. For the wicked boasts of his heart's desire. He blesses the greedy and renounces the Lord. The wicked in his proud countenance does not seek God. God is in none of his thoughts. His ways are always prospering. Your judgments are far above, out of his sight. As for all his enemies, he sneers at them. He has said in his heart, I shall not be moved. I shall never be in adversity. His mouth is full of cursing and deceit and oppression. Under his tongue is trouble and iniquity. He sits in the lurking places of the villages. In the secret places he murders the innocent. His eyes are secretly fixed on the helpless. He lies in wait secretly as a lion in his den. He lies in wait to catch the poor. He catches the poor when he draws him into his net. So he crouches, he lies low, that the helpless may fall by his strength. He has said in his heart, God has forgotten. He hides his face. He will never see. So this is the problem. Now this is a very long explanation. Lots of details given, lots of examples given here. Do you ever think sometimes when you're laying something out before God that you're just complaining? Maybe being a little too detailed, and you're going down the list of all of your hurts, of all of your problems, of all of the ways people have disappointed you. We shouldn't fear doing that. Now, of course, God already knows all of these details and even more that David wrote about here. He knows all about it. But the psalmist is laying out this case. Lord, these are all the things I'm struggling with. And it's wearing down. Even though God knows there is this problem that is given in great detail here. And God's okay with that. Now the next stage would be bargaining or the request in the format of the Psalms. And that's in verses 12 through 15. Arise, O Lord, O God, lift up your hand. Do not forget the humble. Why do the wicked renounce God? He has said in his heart, you will not require an account. But you have seen, for you observe trouble and grief, to repay it by your hand. The helpless commits himself to you. You are the helper of the fatherless. Break the arm of the wicked and the evil man. Seek out his wickedness until you find none. So the request is made for God to rectify this injustice. The wicked are getting away with it, Lord. Don't let them get away with it. Don't let your people be labeled as fools for trusting in you. And that seems to be what's happening. So there's a request made for God to act, to right this wrong. The next stage, to the worldly mind, will be depression. But here it is a motivation to act. Now we see, this is where it gets a little hinky. That's a theological term, by the way. Because it is mixed into the two verses 12 through 15 where the request was made. So you have the request and the motivation to act that is sort of mixed all together. And this is really why God should grant this request, why he should act. And again, this is in stark contrast to worldly thinking. This is not, woe is me, there's nothing good is ever going to happen, why bother? This is just the way things are. No, this is not right, and God is going to take care of this situation. He can't let it stand unresolved. Notice the way David writes in here. He says, God, you will require. See, the wicked man thinks, well, God's not going to require anyone to answer for their action. And David says, oh, no, you will require it, Lord. He knows this. He believes this. He knows that justice is part of God's essential nature. God cannot be unjust. He cannot tolerate injustice. So David knows that he is going to act. And he recounts again to God how he has done in the past. He says, you help the afflicted. How does David know that God helps the afflicted? Because he's seen it. David has faith from previous deliverance. He says, Lord, you've done this before and you have to do it again. You don't have any choice. And God would agree. Now the next stage would be acceptance, but in the Psalms it is praise. There are some similarities as we see. Verses 16 through 18 as the psalm finishes here. The Lord is king forever and ever. The nations have perished out of his hand. Lord, you have heard the desire of the humble. You will prepare their heart. You will cause your ear to hear, to do justice to the fatherless and the oppressed, that the man of earth may oppress no more. peace finally comes, not from just, oh well, this is the way it is, I guess I'll just have to learn to live with it. That would be the acceptance of the worldly mind. No, this peace comes from finally submitting to God's will. This is not just a grim resignation, giving up as it were, but this is joy that is given. Joy that is experienced here by David as a result of this prayer, of this talking with God. Joy and the feeling of a burden lifted. Not, well, I'll just have to find some way to drag this along with me for the rest of my life. David has given this up. He's free. He's turned this over to God and he's up and gone. Leaves it in God's hands. Puts it all on God's shoulders. God, this is your responsibility now. And God says, I got it. No problem. David expects an answer. He expects justice to be done and that his people of God will be delivered. There's some real hope here. We can model this same pattern, this same process here. So that's how it breaks down in Psalm 10. Flip over with just the last few minutes here to Psalm 54. This is a much shorter psalm, so it won't take as long. But I want you to see how this works, how this breaks down with actual scriptures here. Psalm 54. In Psalm 54, again, there we begin with the worldly phase of denial, but the faithful makes an address to God in verses 1 through 2. Save me, O God, by your name, and vindicate me by your strength. Hear my prayer, O God, give ear to the words of my mouth. Again, the psalmist is writing here. This is another psalm of David. And he says, only God can save. Why is he appealing to God? He said, God, you're the only one that can save you. There is no higher authority to appeal to handle this situation. Only God can save. His holy and powerful name. He's the one in charge. He alone hears prayers and can act on man's behalf. The next stage would be anger or the complaint that is given. In verse 3, here's the problem. Strangers have risen up against me, and oppressors have sought after my life. They have not set God before them. David is saying there are enemies that threaten me. And it's not just that they're threatening me, but they reject God. Now that's upsetting in itself. Just wicked behavior, people living without God, that's sad for them certainly. Makes everyone else's life difficult too. But the idea here is that David is saying that I'm suffering because I honor God. They don't honor you, God. I do, and because I put you first, because I honor you and follow you, I am oppressed. I am suffering, and that's unjust, and it needs to be taken care of. That's the problem that David faces here. In verse 4, in a worldly mind, there would be a state of depression, but here there's a motivation to act. In verse 4 of Psalm 54, behold, God is my helper. The Lord is with those who uphold my life. Now this is where things get strange again, because the bargaining and the request have gotten flipped around here. Those two stages have gotten turned around, and the depression, the motivation to act had actually come first. But there's not a feeling of despair here, but rather there's a feeling of hope and expectation. There is faith that is based on previous actions on God's part, previous deliverance, and trusting in the nature of God and in His character. David says, God, I know you're going to take care of this because it's your nature. You cannot abide these things to stand. Next would come the bargaining and the request stage. Again, they're sort of mixed around sometimes. But it's interesting here, David doesn't really even feel the need to make the request. In verse 5, he says, He will repay my enemies for their evil. Cut them off in your truth. He's speaking about God and to God there. It's almost like he's giving an aside to anyone who's listening to this. He'll take care of this. He will repay my enemies for their evil. And then he turned back to God and said, Lord, cut them off in your truth. David, it's almost as if he doesn't really feel the need to make the request. God knows the problem, and He's going to take care of it. It's a done deal. He knows God's faithfulness will not stand for this, and that He will act. So there's confidence there. Verses 6 and 7, we see the acceptance phase or the praise here in the Psalms. I will freely sacrifice to you. I will praise your name, O Lord, for it is good. For he has delivered me out of all trouble, and my eye has seen its desire upon my enemies. He says, I will make offerings to God. So we have sort of thanksgiving in advance, expecting God's solution. David's already got his thanksgiving offering planned. He's so confident God is going to handle this problem perfectly and righteously. He's already planned out how he's going to thank God with the offerings and the sacrifices that he's going to make. Confident in God's solution. Offering praise of God's past benevolence to the faithful and trust that that trend will continue. Great words of faith here. These are lament psalms. These are sad, we might say, but they're not. They're not if we see the hope and the confidence that's in them. I want to point out to you again the contrast between the worldly method of dealing with struggle versus the way of the faithful. It is not a process of anger and panic and fear and desperation and joyless acceptance of, well, that's just the way it's going to be. But rather the Christian immediately runs to God and seeks help, knowing that help will be found. There is a reminder of God's past help, what he's done in the past. There's a recounting of how God has behaved in these situations in the past. And that's not to bring it to God's recollection. God, remember now, this is the way you act in these situations, so this is what I need you to do this time. God doesn't need a reminder. Rather, it is to remind the Christian. Not trying to guilt God into action. Lord, I know that you don't abide injustice in these situations, and if you let this go, that's not going to look too good on you. Not trying to guilt God and manipulate him into action, but simply recognizing it. It's not a reminder to God, but it's a reminder to the Christian, to us, that God is just and good, that he is aware of these things, and they upset him too. And he will not sit idly by and let these wrongs go unnoticed or untended. Now, God will not always remove the problem immediately or deliver us from them. Sometimes, instead of taking the problem away from us, he comes up next to us and carries us through the problem with his help. A lot of times we prefer, God, just remove this stumbling, just take this problem away from me so I don't have to deal with it. Sometimes he does that, but often he instead comes alongside of us and helps us through that problem, facing it together, leaning on his strength, and then we come out stronger on the other side. So we saw here tonight that the Psalms don't always match up perfectly with that pattern, with that template, but the principles apply. And that's what we can take. Sometimes it takes us a bit of thinking, a bit of work to see the pattern in God's Word. And likewise, God's solutions don't always match up perfectly with our wishes or what seems logical and reasonable to us. But it's then that we just have to persevere and trust in his wisdom and in his character. Or as one writer put it, when we can't see God's hands, we have to trust his heart. Maybe you're grieving over disappointments or failures or struggles. Maybe you're somewhere in these 5 stages of grief. A lot of people get stuck in anger for a while. If that's the case, we want to pray for you that God may give you the strength to break out of that. Maybe you're grieving over your sins. Maybe you realize for the first time that you are not in a right relationship with God and you need to have your sins forgiven. You need to have them washed away in the waters of baptism in obedience to the gospel command. If that's your need, we want to help you fulfill that tonight. Or if you require the prayers of the church for something that you're struggling with, we want to pray for you. We want to come alongside you and lend our shoulders to your burden. If we can help anyone tonight, please make your need known to us. Let us show our love for you and our support and our prayers. Please make that need known to us. Come forward as we stand and sing this song.
The great physician.